and welcome back. My name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's chief tech correspondent. Late last year, the European Commission released two flagship policy proposals to regulate the tech sector. One was the Digital Services Act, and one was the Digital Markets Act. Today, during this panel discussion, we'll be diving into the Digital Markets Act, or DMA, and discuss with a panel of experts how the policy will shift the competitive landscape within Europe's tech sector. Before we get going, and I introduce the panel, just a few live stream where you're watching this now. Also, if you want to use Twitter, you can send me your questions through the hashtag Politico Competition. So with that out of the way, let me introduce specifically working on the Digital Markets Act. We've got Monique Goyen, the Director General from the European Consumer Organization, Fran Burrell, a Distinguished Fellow from the Atlantic Council, and finally Adam Cohen, the Director of Economic Policy at Google. Thank you so much for joining us. Evelyn, I want to come to you first in terms of setting the scene. Right now, the discussion around the DMA is focusing primarily on the European Parliament in terms of scope, focus, etc. There has been some discussion with some of your colleagues in the Parliament about limiting the DMA solely to some of the big and largest US tech companies in terms of making sure it streamline it, as well as sort of make sure it gets through the institutions. I just want to get your perspective on what do you think of that proposal, and where do we stand right now in terms of the parliamentary thinking on what the DMA should look like?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to discuss with you today. And I have to say that this DMA is a very historical opportunity to ensure innovation and fairness in the internet. And that is what we have to discuss on. And the European Commission proposed a scope where nobody knows really well how many of these gatekeepers will be on board. And the proposal of Mr. Schwab is to narrow it. I have to say I'm not agreeing to that. I'm not agreeing to that because we don't want to make an anti-Americanismus, because at the end it would be only a law against the biggest of one, which are the American one. But we want to have fairness in gatekeeping in the whole. So we have to enlarge the scope of that proposal of the European Commission to ensure that we have at the end really a fair play within these matters. We want to have fair play for the consumers. We want to have fair play for end users, and also for little and middle-sized businesses who have to work with these platforms, and where we want that all the possibilities of innovation are taken on board. And so we have to do more than it is proposed today.
Before we come to the other panelists, I just want to follow up on that. So if the idea is not to solely focus on sort of GAFA and maybe Microsoft or maybe the other large tech companies, how large would you like that enlargement to be? What would the scope for you be in terms of what companies should be involved?
So I want, for example, to change the thresholds and to say not with to have 23 million of users, of end users. That is one of the possibilities. And I want also to have the way of counting enlarged, not only the core services, but the broad services which are in the hands of platforms has to be counted with. That are some of the proposals I will give tomorrow in translation.
Wonderful. You heard it here first. Monique, can I just turn to you from a consumer's perspective? There is a balance, right, between limiting the new rules to a small subset of companies and then potentially missing out on the next companies coming down the pipeline. From the consumer side of things, where do you think that balance should be?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to the consumer perspective. It's a very important debate, and we very much support the DMA because it sets clear rules on what is and what is not allowed when you are a platform. And that's why we also believe that the broader scope is the best attitude to adopt in that context. Because what we're seeing now is that the current rule that apply to platforms when it comes to protecting the competitiveness of the single market, they take ages to be enforced, and the platforms use their immense resources to just delay a final decision, and in the meantime competition is dying a silent death. So we believe it must be a very robust piece of legislation that needs to have the broadest scope possible. We have still some improvements also to propose, but maybe I come back to that later.
Wonderful. Adam, I'm presuming you're not asking for Google solely to be included in here, but do you not see some merit in limiting the number of companies involved in the DMA, purely from as Monique mentioned, it is a long, lengthy process already?
Well, when I hear this discussion about scope, I don't pay too much attention because, frankly, I know that we're going to be involved in this, whether you're talking about platform regulation or structuring platforms or firms with superior cross-market status. There are all these different terms that are being thrown around at the moment. I think what's really important is that this framework, and we're supportive of some of these ambitions, this framework should be enable regulators and the companies that are subject to these rules to move quickly and move pragmatically. The things that worry us most about this are some of the rigidities that you might find in the regulation about how particular products should be designed, how they should work, and that doesn't leave as much room potentially for innovation. Now, I acknowledge that we want innovation. We want to be sure that that innovation occurs in a competitive and open marketplace. I think that there's a lot of room for the companies that are subject to these rules to work with the regulator to explain certain business practices and to get to pragmatic solutions quite quickly.
Fran, maybe from a Washington perspective, seeing this from the outside, we are in the middle of sort of the typical EU institutional rugby fight between sort of what happens next. I just was interesting from a Washington perspective, where do you see this discussion going in terms of what's going on right now in DC?
Well, I think that in DC, what we are seeing is a real shift in attitudes on the regulation of big tech, and particularly in the area of competition policy. It's not at all clear where it's going to go. The Biden administration did not make this a huge campaign pledge, and we don't have clear guidance from the administration itself. What we have is a lot of bubbling up in Congress, and we have some key appointments, especially Lina Khan at the FTC and Tim Wu in the White House, who have a track record of questioning our, shall we say, our established way of looking at antitrust. And I think that there's a growing consensus here that something will happen, that there will be some stronger regulation than there has been in the past, but I don't think there's a consensus about what that is. I do think that the intersection of the European and the US debates are likely to be very important. And two elements I would draw on. First, if the thresholds end up identifying only US companies, that could have a sharp political impact here. I think also the fundamental premise of the DMA that different companies, different platforms based on their size and network effects have different rules than others is also something that is not the norm in the way the US addresses these things. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation across the Atlantic on these issues.
It's a very polite way of saying that they don't agree, but Monique, you wanted to respond.
Yes, I wanted not to Frances, because I think that she has made a lot of very important points, but to Adam, because Adam said something like that they would like to work with the regulators to explain the business models and to find practical solutions. Can I just please call a spade a spade? I'm quite since a long time in this job, and every time I have heard a platform or a big tech company saying that they want to work with regulators, the objective and the effect was delaying any concrete regulatory action in the interest of consumers. And explaining a business model was only as far as it would not reveal anything that would be harming the company. So I really think that this time is over, a little bit like what is happening in DC and in the rest of the United States. Now is the time to regulate platforms. They have over years and years have benefited from a very weak regulatory oversight system. It's time to get serious now. They are taking over the world, not only in terms of markets, but also in terms of societies and democracies. And it's high time that competition, at least on the market side, that competition is being safeguarded by strict ex-ante rules that explain what is and what is not allowed for those platforms to undertake.
Adam, it seems only fair to offer you a right to respond to that.
It wouldn't be a good panel discussion without this, I suppose. I think you can look back at the record of the various cases and investigations where Google has been involved. Take, for example, the wide-ranging European Commission investigation into different aspects of our business that started at the end of 2009 and early 2010. We heard from the European Commission in May of 2012, the areas of their preliminary concern. They hadn't identified concrete harms. And a few weeks later, we went back to them and said, here are some things we think we can do to address your concerns. I think that's a pragmatic and very certainly speedy approach that we demonstrated 8-9 years ago. And that's been our practice in other investigations. We recently reached a settlement with the French Competition Authority around some of our online advertising intermediation practices. We've been in discussions with the UK Competition Authority about changes that we haven't even made yet to the way that third-party cookies work online. We have a demonstrated track record of working quickly and pragmatically, and I think we'd like to be judged by that.
I think it would be only fair to say that I think the remedies you offered to the Commission were rejected eventually in relation to those cases. Maybe Evelyn, could just come to you in terms of where you see the new DMA.
Those remedies those remedies were accepted by the Commission, right? They were rejected by various complainants that felt that they weren't sufficient to address their concerns. But the ultimate remedy in what turned out to be the shopping case didn't look substantially different from what had been discussed in the summer of 2012. Yeah, it was a slightly different implementation, but if we had focused on that remedy discussion rather than the process of market testing and whether or not complainants were happy, we probably would have gotten to that outcome in a much faster and more pragmatic way. And everyone in the marketplace, us, DG Competition, and some of the complainants probably would have felt that this issue was resolved sooner.
Evelyn, to you, fair play, Adam. I suppose before we go further, we do have to say that the Commission did eventually decide to do a statement of objections. We can come back to that in a second. Evelyn, just to you, in terms of where you see the DMA fitting in this, a lot of this is about speed. Digital markets, as we all know, move a lot faster than typically regulation. My concern with the DMA is, although it seems to be going pretty fast for Brussels, we're still looking at an 18-month, 24-month window potentially. Is that not, although laudable, still going to allow potential platforms to cement their position in new and sort of new markets?
I'm not sure that I did really understand your question, because it's not really clear on here. But first of all, I wanted to add somewhat to the discussion before. What we learned from the past is that competition law is not enough to tackle with these things, and we have to have ex-ante regulation, and this internal market way is the right way to do. And the second thing we have to learn, if I well understood your question, is that we have to speedy a little bit the proposals the European Commission did make, because we don't don't think that it is necessary to need 2, 3, 4 years at the end to have clearance. We have to be speedier and ensure that not only consumers but also the businesses and the platforms knows really very well in due time what they can do and what they don't have to do, and to ensure that it is well done at the end.
The title of the discussion is sort of leveling the playing field. And therefore, I just want to maybe just focus on the end game here. What is the purpose of the DMA in terms of providing greater choice for consumers, potential rivals, greater space online to compete with the Facebooks and Googles of this world? Maybe Monique, as the voice of the consumer here, I presume you're going to say it's consumer choice. How much, though, are you concerned that as much as the DMA might help, that it has become a corporate lobbying fight between companies who do and do not want to be included in the rules?
Yes, indeed, really the objective is about to have the freedom of consumer choice, because currently what we see is that choice of consumers is being manipulated because the platforms are keeping the gates. That's why they are gatekeepers. Now, so the intention is really the right one from the DMA, where we think that they need really to be much more broad in the objective and in the scope, is indeed not to limit the conversation to a business user versus platform conversation. And there we also believe that there should be much more consideration being given to the consumer angle. For example, when we speak about interoperability, it's about interoperability between the platforms, the core platforms, and the ancillary services of the business users. But we also would like to have interoperability or let's say freedom of consumer choice between core platforms, for example, between social networks or between instant messaging services. So this consumer angle needs to be really much more prominent in what we hope the work that the European Parliament and the Council is going to make. Another element is that what is missing is also protecting consumers against circumvention by the platforms of their obligation. For example, gatekeepers could be able to still go on manipulating consumer choice by interface design, by making it more difficult for consumers to install or uninstall apps. And that's what some of us call, and we certainly call that, dark patterns, because you are being locked in the platform's ecosystem by making it just complicated for you in very concrete terms to change your default settings or to change just the choices that you would like to undertake. In terms also of enforcement, there is a lot that needs to be said on enforcement. On the consumer angle, again, there is no consumer right. You cannot participate in the investigations, you cannot file a formal complaint, and you don't have a right currently, as it is written, to go to court in your country if DMA has not been respected. And so there are some really shortcomings that need to be addressed for us to be a really consumer-friendly legislation.
Without looking to make this sort of a consumer versus a Google conversation, because I want to make sure we get every voice in, I was maybe, Adam, from your perspective, I mean, there is a question of what is the point of the DMA? And I presume from Google's perspective, and again, I'll let you speak, it is about, choice is a click away, but, a level playing field must be for everybody, not just for some of the participants.
Well, I think there's this tension between the idea of delivering innovation in all aspects of your business, competing vigorously, and weighing the impact that competition might have on the broader marketplace. Take, for example, the development of Google Maps, which was almost 20 years ago now. There were existing mapping providers in the world, and Google actually, we talked to some of them and said, look, we think we can work with you and do a better job of surfacing information in search results. When somebody comes and searches for an address, we can maybe show them a pinpoint on a map. That technology didn't exist at the time. Something that people use every day now simply wasn't available in the market. And the other mapping providers that existed at that time said, no, that's not what we do. We don't want to work with you. We don't want to merge our products or integrate in any particular way. So Google went out and invested billions to build its own map of the world, to drive streets, fly over different uninhabited parts of the world to build the world's best map. And that is a form of competition that certainly has had an effect on incumbent map makers and other technologies. You want to encourage that, right? You want to encourage companies, including big companies, to take technologies just a step further, to improve the technologies that people are using on a daily basis. And some of that is going to have an effect on the dynamics or the competitive dynamics of a marketplace. And competition policy has had to wrestle with these trade-offs and these difficult decisions of, well, is this the type of innovation we want to promote, or is this something that, because of the impact in the competitive dynamics, we should probably try to stop? And I think the right answer to this is to build tools that are flexible enough where good judgment can prevail. Very fixed, inflexible tools will probably lead to unintended consequences.
I think, Fran, you had a comment to that, and then I'll come to you, Evelyn.
So I wanted to return to the idea of a level playing field, because I think that this is a very vague concept. And for example, in Washington right now, we're using this when talking about the Chinese and resilient tech infrastructure. So it can be used in a whole lot of different ways. But it reminds me that one of the main purposes or the origins of the DMA and the current push in digital regulation in the EU is really about or comes out of the feeling that the EU does not have a gatekeeper of its own or several gatekeepers of its own. And I think that, certainly given Europe's startup base and its record in large companies and global companies, that one should expect that. But it's not clear to me that the DMA is the answer to that particular element. I'm very sympathetic and certainly appreciate all the statements that were made about consumers. As a consumer myself, I tend to be extremely cautious about how widely I'm spread across the web, to be very frank. But I wonder if this is the way forward. It strikes me that it encourages companies to go up the ladder towards being a gatekeeper, using one set of tools as business practices. And then when they become gatekeepers, different rules are put on them. I think that the comment that maybe the thresholds should be enlarged so that American companies aren't the only ones targeted only shows how political the threshold level is. So I think that we need to kind of take a moment to think about, there is a need for some kind of regulation or more aggressive antitrust. I am particularly concerned about different network effects when you put different platforms from different areas together, in effect, in one company. We have a new, so new it hasn't done anything yet, competition dialogue between the United States and the EU. I think that this is something worth exploring, because I think one of the issues over the past few years has been the lack of antitrust in the tech field in the United States. So I think that we need to have more conversations across the Atlantic, since it is going to be mostly American firms that are affected. And I would hope that there could be enough time. Mark, you brought up the 2-year window, and I think that's okay. But I think there should be enough time in the legislative process for some discussions across the Atlantic about this kind of law.
Evelyn, I think you had your hand up to make a point. Can I also maybe just ask you about sort of that sort of transatlantic cooperation element? If it does feel that, many of your counterparts in Washington and some of the states are doing similar things.
I think, first of all, I want to say I acknowledge absolutely that Google, Amazon, and others have made many investitions made many good things, and that is okay. But in the same time, we see that such gatekeepers are making self-preferencing for their own products or services, or they discriminate offers of competitors on in imposing specific payment services or other things. So, and that's the reason why we have to ensure that at the end such things are tackled with the DMA, and that is what we need. And when I hear from Madame Goyens that we need also portability, and I think it's a very important matter. I know that some of the social medias have some particularities. That is okay. They can take it. They can take it. That is not a problem. But on the basics of these social medias, we have to have a portability, not on the whole system, but on the basis. And that is what we have to discuss about, what we have to ensure at the end, so that people can make it. We speak today from as I named WhatsApp and Signal and Streamer and whatever, but there is no possibility to go through against. It was possible with email. Why not with the social media? And that is what we want, what we need to ensure that we have really a good outcome for end users and for the citizens.
Monique, I think you had a comment. No, Adam, we'll come to you in a second. Monique had a hand up. Thank you.
You wanted a dynamic conversation, Mark. You get a dynamic conversation. So what I just wanted to say is that I heard from Adam again. Sorry, I'm not really targeting you, but there is there is rather evidence to the contrary that a monopolistic situation is not the one that triggers most innovation. And when you say, what innovation do you want? In a market economy, who decides what innovation you want? It's the consumer. And therefore, you need to have a very competitive environment in order for the consumer to be able to vote with their feet. And therefore, we believe that it's very important, if you want to innovate also in the digital transformation economy that we are for the moment living in, you need to provide access to the consumer for all those companies that are coming with innovative ideas and that for the moment are being kept out of the market because gatekeepers have decided so. So it should not be the platforms who decide what type of innovation we want. And that's a very clear signal.
Thank you. Adam, you had
I completely agree with that. And I would say that the only thing that we as a platform would request is the ability to be part of the group of companies that are striving to build better products, to continue to attract consumers, to continue to evolve how we serve those consumers. We don't want regulation that forces us to provide static products, just like other companies that won't be in scope for the DMA will be able to create new and differentiated products. We want to be able to do the same. So we're not suggesting that we dictate the rules, but only that we are able to participate and compete the same way as other firms. I want to say something about this interoperability point, because I think it's quite interesting. I think interoperability has been important in various settings in the technology world over time. It's certainly something that Google has promoted through our Android operating system, for example, and many of our services, which are seamlessly integrate with third-party services. One of the ideas is that these communication tools need to be interoperable. And I think there's a case where you could think about creating that kind of interoperability and accidentally or unintentionally ensuring that those types of communication tools that are interoperable then become an unassailable type of standard. And I think that the fact that we're using Zoom today might illustrate this. If you imagined a world where everyone was using Google Hangouts and Apple's Hangout technology, or like the meeting technology, Facebook's meeting technology, and all of these technologies were interoperable and everyone used them, I think there would be much less room for a novel technology like Zoom, which none of us were using before this pandemic, to come in and say, this is our technology, we do these things differently, they probably would have been subsumed or just simply interoperated with the incumbent technologies. So there are trade-offs in each of these types of decisions. There isn't an unalloyed good that everything being interoperable will necessarily lead to more competition and more differentiation. There's some very difficult questions that I think need deeper analysis.
Thank you. No one mentioned Skype for Business, which I'm very glad for, or Microsoft Teams. Just a couple, Fran, I'll just come to you in a second. I just want to, we're having some questions coming in, so I want to say thank you to the audience for that participation. One specifically is about enforcement, and it feels right now that there is a slightly tug of war going on between who gets to enforce the DMA. Is it the DG Comp through the Commission, or is it national regulators and authorities, or is it a mixture of both? Evelyn, as someone involved in sort of, helping to draft these rules, where do you see that balance between the Brussels authorities leading these potential investigations and the role that some of the national regulators would like to play?
Yeah. First of all, I think that 80% in the European Commission is not really very much. And so we have a need to see how we can ensure that at the end the work can be done. And so I think it is necessary to take on board also the national authorities to help the European Commission. But when it comes on to enforcement at itself, I think that has to be done at the European level, very clearly, because we cannot agree to have a differentiation of answers within the European Union. We need European answers on that. And so I say clearly, yes, the national authorities could be or should be taken on board as helping the European Commission, or as a platform where the businesses or others can say, yes, we have a problem with one or the other gatekeeper, and can you bring it to the European Commission? But the enforcement at itself, that has been done by the European Commission. That's very clear.
Makes sense. Fran, I think you wanted to make a point maybe about the previous comment, and then Monique, I'll come to you.
So just to add on enforcement, I totally agree about that. It needs to be consistent across the 27, and not have companies go to different member states, or to have different results depending upon which member state you're in. I wanted to go back to the question of interoperability. I was talking to a major retail chain, and the point that they brought up was that when customers wanted to move from their club, if you will, to another company's club, the question was, which data do they take with them? And can that data, if they take their shopping history, for example, can that be re-engineered so that their competitor can figure out their algorithm? So I think there are lots of very specific issues in some of these restrictions, and some of the things that I think we all want: interoperability and portability. So I think there are questions, though, about intellectual property that need to be considered very carefully. And that's not to say that we shouldn't push for protecting the consumers and giving the consumers maximum freedoms, but I just think we need, what really drives innovation is the protection of intellectual property. And so we need to figure that out, particularly when it comes to algorithms. And I think that that's something that it would be good if there was consistency across the Atlantic about how that is handled. So I'll just put that on the table.
Thank you for that. Monique, you had a comment about enforcement, or?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Well, I totally agree with Mrs. Gebhardt. I think we are fragmentation of national enforcement against global companies has really shown to be totally ineffective. So yes, there must be an EU-wide enforcement competence, and there must be more resources for the Commission to be able to carry out those new tasks. What I wanted to say, of course, there must be cooperation with the national authorities, but what I really would like to stress is that this is beyond competition authorities. We believe that other national authorities have a role to play in, flagging, in transferring complaints or in transferring investigations. Can be competition authorities, of course, but also consumer protection authorities or data protection authorities, because there is much more to gatekeeping than just competition law. And so we believe that there is really room for an ecosystem of cooperation between different national authorities and the European Commission.
Thank you. With the time we have left, I just have one quick question in terms of how this fits in with the broader discussions going on both in the US, Australia, India, and elsewhere. One thing that comes up quite a lot and was brought up by the US officials when they were in Brussels a couple of weeks ago was, how does the DMA fit in with global trade rules? In terms of if this becomes too discriminatory against specific companies, it might go against what is laid out within the WTO. Evelyn, from a sort of policy parliamentarian perspective, I mean, what do you make of that, ensuring that obviously Europe is able to protect its consumers and create this so-called level playing field, but also put it in the context of existing global rules around the WTO?
Yeah, the global rules we have to ensure that they are taken on board. That is really very clear. So within that, we make it. But we have shown as the European Union that we are able to make laws in cases as we did make it with GDPR. And after that, the rest of the world is looking for that and sometimes takes the same on board. So we are not only making what others are making, we have our own ways to work, and that is good as such. And we look clearly what the Australian, was US, was UK are making, but in the same time we are saying very clearly we see the needs we have within the European Union and we tackle with it.
Adam, this is an argument that I've heard from some of your colleagues in the past in terms of DMA and potential discrimination. I mean, what is your view on how the DMA is going to fit in with that?
Well, I'm not an expert on these types of WTO issues. I think I would reiterate what I described earlier, that I think we're in favor of a regulation that leads to sensible and pragmatic outcomes at speed. And I think that we have to decide whether those are going to be based on evidence, whether they're going to there will be interventions that favor consumers or whether they favor competitors, and to figure out a way to navigate some of these trade-offs that exist in the technology space. This is a fast-moving sector. I've been at Google for 11 years, and very little of what we do today resembles the way that Google worked when I joined. I think the critical thing is to create a regulatory framework that's going to be fast, but also flexible and fit for the future.
I have to say, 11 years ago, search existed, yes? So some things never change. Fran, before I wrap up, I think I'm going to leave you the last word, not to ask you to speak on behalf of the US government.
Mark, we could go into that, but I mean, search looks fundamentally different, and the technology that underpins search has changed dramatically since then. I mean, we could roll back search to 11 years ago, and would that address the concerns and the complaints that we're hearing today? Is that your contention? I would argue that in order for search to be effective for consumers, it can't be static, right? These technologies shouldn't look, I mean, a competitive marketplace, no technology should look like it did 10, 15, I would argue even a year ago. We want that type of investment. We want that type of dynamism, and we don't want products, even if they're the quote unquote same product, to resemble what they did in the past.
Fran, to you, I just want to get your thoughts on, again, I'm not asking you to speak for the Biden administration, but in terms of where you believe Washington sees the DMA in terms of global rules, potentially discriminatory practices, is that something they should be concerned about?
Yes, and I think that this is a reason for focusing on the practices, and there are practices that are used by companies that are deleterious to a contestable market. I think we should have more information about, exclusivity contracts, self-preferencing, using data from third-party sellers to disadvantage those sellers, all the types of things that are mentioned in the DMA. But should we focus on the rules rather than identifying companies and applying those rules only to them, which in my mind is discriminatory, especially since where you set the threshold is inherently going to be political. So are there behaviors and practices that really affect the contestability of the markets? And we should be looking at those.
Thank you. And with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time. It was a particularly spicy conversation. So I really do want to say thank you so much to our participants. Like the DMA, if anything, needs to be a bit wider and broader, and there needs to be a focus both on consumers as well as the actual outcomes, both for some of the large platforms as well as some of the small, up and coming, if you will, platforms that will be involved. Minutes at 2:45 Brussels time with my colleague Laura as he tackles the topic of tech sovereignty with a lineup of very knowledgeable speakers. Stay tuned and thank you very much.